In a world where strength was currency and submission was sin, Alara Nightshade had learned to make herself invisible, long before she understood why visibility was dangerous. Born Omega, in a realm that worshipped alpha dominance, she had spent 22 years perfecting the art of disappearance, moving through shadows, speaking in whispers, existing in the spaces between acknowledgement and exile, where the unwanted learned to survive. The Lycan kingdom did not love its Omegas. It tolerated them as necessary evils, vessels for bloodline continuation, and reminders of the natural order that kept chaos from consuming everything civilization had built. They were soft where the world demanded hardness, gentle where survival required claws, submissive where power was the only protection that mattered. Alara had accepted her place in this hierarchy with the quiet resignation of someone who understood that fighting fate only brought pain. She kept her head down, her voice soft, her presence so minimal that most Lycans forgot she existed until duty demanded otherwise. In a castle filled with predators who measured worth by the strength of one's growl and the sharpness of one's teeth, she had become a ghost haunting the edges of a story she was never meant to influence, until the Lycan Council decided her invisibility made her perfect for their purposes. King Kael'draven needed a mate, not from desire, but from political necessity that demanded royal bloodlines continue regardless of personal preference. The most feared alpha in recorded history, a ruler whose contempt for Omega weakness was legendary throughout the territories, would be bound to the very thing he despised most. And Alara, forgotten daughter of minor nobility with no voice to refuse and no power to resist, would become the unwilling bride to a man who looked at her like she was a stain on his sovereignty. What the council could not foresee was the child that would grow from duty's cold embrace, an heir that defied every law of genetics and hierarchy, carrying within its developing form the power to reshape kingdoms and challenge assumptions that had governed Lycan society for 1,000 years. In the space between hatred and possession, between the Omega everyone underestimated and the king who had never learned to need anyone, a bond would form that had nothing to do with choice and everything to do with the dangerous truth that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the things we resist most fiercely. The weak would become mighty, the unwanted would become irreplaceable, and love, real, complicated, defiant love, would bloom in the ruins of everything both had been taught to believe about strength, worth, and the price of power that demanded hearts be offered as sacrifice to the throne's endless hunger. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The summons came on a morning when frost painted the windows of Nightshade Manor, in patterns that looked like warnings written in a language Alara had never learned to read. She found the formal scroll waiting beside her breakfast, black wax seal bearing the Lycan Council's ancient crest, elegant script that somehow managed to sound ominous even in its carefully neutral phrasing. Lady Alara Nightshade is commanded to appear before the council at the next rising of the full moon to discuss matters of territorial significance and royal obligation. Territorial significance. Royal obligation. Words that meant nothing and everything, spoken in the careful euphemisms that power used when it wanted to destroy lives without acknowledging the cruelty inherent in its decisions. Alara set the scroll aside with hands that trembled only slightly, her practiced composure intact despite the cold certainty settling in her stomach like lead. At 22, she had lived long enough to understand that when the council summoned minor Omega nobility for discussions about royal obligations, the conversations rarely ended with everyone returning home unchanged. Bad news? Her stepmother asked without looking up from her own correspondence. Lady Helena's tone carrying the kind of detached interest that suggested she already knew exactly what that scroll contained. The council wants to see me, Alara replied quietly, reaching for her tea with movements that she hoped appeared steadier than they felt. How interesting. Lady Helena's smile was sharp as winter wind. I imagine they have some opportunity in mind that would benefit the families standing at court. Opportunity. Another euphemism. Another way of describing decisions made by others about futures that belonged to people with no voice in their own fate. Alara had been hearing variations of that word since childhood, usually preceded by explanations about duty and bloodline obligations, and the special responsibilities that came with Omega heritage. 3 days later, she found herself standing in the council chamber, at the heart of the royal capital, surrounded by stone walls that had witnessed centuries of political maneuvering, and lives reshaped by the whims of those who confused authority with wisdom. The 7 council members sat elevated on their ceremonial thrones, faces carved from years of making hard decisions and sleeping peacefully despite the consequences that rained down on those too powerless to resist. Lady Alara Nightshade, Chancellor Garrett spoke with the kind of formal courtesy that somehow managed to sound like condescension dressed in silk. "Thank you for answering our summons so promptly. Please, take a seat so we may discuss the matter at hand." She settled into the single chair positioned in the center of the chamber, acutely aware that its placement made her feel like a defendant awaiting judgment, rather than a participant in any meaningful conversation. Around her, the council members studied her with expressions that revealed nothing while calculating everything: her bloodline, her potential value, her complete lack of political leverage that made her perfect for whatever purpose they had in mind. "The kingdom faces a delicate situation," Council Leader Matthias began, his weathered features betraying no emotion, as he delivered what sounded like the opening of a carefully rehearsed speech. "His Majesty King Kael Draven requires a mate, not from personal desire, but from political necessity that cannot be delayed indefinitely. The bloodline must continue, alliances must be solidified, and certain expectations must be managed regarding royal succession." Alara felt her throat tighten as understanding began to crystallize around words that hadn't yet been spoken directly. They weren't discussing some abstract political theory. They were discussing her future, her life, her body as a vessel, for purposes that served everyone's interests except her own. "The challenge," Chancellor Garrett continued smoothly, "lies in finding a suitable candidate who meets the crown's particular requirements. His Majesty has been remarkably selective in his previous considerations, declining numerous proposals from prominent alpha families whose daughters possess impeccable bloodlines and significant political advantages. His Majesty," added Councillor Thorne with diplomatic delicacy, "has expressed certain reservations about traditional alpha-alpha unions. He believes such partnerships might create complications regarding hierarchy and territorial authority that could destabilize existing power structures." What they weren't saying echoed louder than their careful words. King Kael Draven had rejected every prominent alpha daughter in the realm, not because they lacked beauty or breeding or political value, but because his legendary arrogance couldn't tolerate the possibility of a mate who might challenge his absolute dominance. He wanted someone who would submit completely, disappear into the background of his reign, provide heirs without requiring acknowledgement of their contributions to his legacy. He wanted an Omega. Specifically, he wanted an Omega so thoroughly beaten down by life that she would accept marriage to a man who despised everything she represented while being grateful for the privilege of serving his bloodline's continuation. "Lady Alara," Council Leader Matthias said gently, his tone carrying the kind of false warmth that accompanied life-altering pronouncements disguised as generous offers. "Your family's service to the crown has been noted and appreciated. Your father's diplomatic work in the Eastern Territories earned considerable gratitude from the royal administration, and your own qualities seem well suited to the delicate responsibilities that come with royal partnership." Qualities. Another euphemism for characteristics that made her useful rather than valued. Her Omega nature that guaranteed submission. Her minor nobility that provided legitimacy without political complications. Her complete lack of family influence that ensured she could be discarded easily if the arrangement proved inconvenient. "I don't understand," she said quietly, though she understood perfectly, and was simply hoping that speaking the words aloud might make them untrue. "Are you suggesting that We are suggesting nothing," Chancellor Garrett interrupted with smooth authority. "We are informing you of the Council's decision, reached after considerable deliberation and consultation with His Majesty regarding his preferences for royal partnership. The formal betrothal will be announced within the week, with the ceremony to follow at the next new moon." The words hit her like physical blows, each syllable carefully chosen to sound like honor being bestowed, rather than freedom being stripped away. Marriage to King Kael Draven, the most feared alpha in living memory, a ruler whose contempt for Omega weakness was legendary throughout the territories, whose previous interactions with her social class had been marked by dismissive cruelty, rather than even basic courtesy. "Your honors," she managed, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect. "Surely there are other candidates better suited to such an important position. I have no experience with court life, no training in royal protocols, no understanding of the complex responsibilities that come with Precisely why you're perfect for the role, Counselor Thorne said with satisfaction that made her stomach turn. His Majesty requires a mate who will adapt to his preferences rather than bringing preconceived notions about royal marriage dynamics. Someone who will complement his strength rather than competing with it. Someone who would disappear into the shadows of his reign without leaving traces that might complicate future political arrangements. Someone disposable enough that her eventual replacement, should circumstances require one, could be managed without significant diplomatic fallout. Alara sat in silence, processing the magnitude of what was being imposed upon her, while 7 of the most powerful Lycans in the kingdom watched her reaction with the detached interest of scientists observing an experiment. They expected compliance, of course. Expected gratitude for being chosen to serve purposes greater than her individual desires. Expected her to understand that Omega nobility had been bred for exactly these kinds of sacrificial obligations. What they didn't expect was the question that emerged from depths she hadn't known she possessed, spoken with quiet dignity that surprised even her. Does His Majesty know about this decision? Has he been informed that the Council intends to bind him to someone he's never met, whose very existence contradicts everything he's publicly stated about appropriate royal partnerships? The silence that followed her words felt charged with dangerous possibilities. Council members exchanged glances that spoke of communications beyond her ability to interpret, calculations being adjusted in response to behavior that deviated from anticipated patterns. His Majesty, Council Leader Matthias said carefully, has been fully informed of the Council's recommendation and has given his consent to proceed with arrangements as outlined. His consent. Not his enthusiasm, not his approval, not even his resigned acceptance. Just consent, the minimal acknowledgement required to make legal proceedings technically valid, while absolving him of responsibility for personal feelings about the arrangement. I see, Alara said quietly, and in that moment she truly did see the complete picture of how thoroughly her life was about to be reshaped by forces beyond her control, how completely she was about to be delivered to a man who would look at her like a burden imposed by political necessity rather than a partner chosen for any quality she actually possessed. The announcement will be made tomorrow evening at the Harvest Festival, Chancellor Garrett informed her with the brisk efficiency of someone concluding routine business. You'll be expected to appear beside His Majesty during the formal ceremonies, displaying appropriate gratitude for the honor being bestowed upon your family line. Appropriate gratitude for being sold to a man who hated her by birthright, delivered to a marriage that would be cold at best, and potentially dangerous if his legendary contempt for Omega weakness translated into personal cruelty behind closed doors. But Alara simply nodded, rising from her chair with the same quiet dignity that had sustained her through 22 years of being overlooked, undervalued, and treated as more obligation than person. Of course, Your Honors. I understand my duties and will fulfill them as required. As she walked from the council chamber through corridors lined with portraits of former queens, most of them alpha women whose strength and political connections had made them partners rather than possessions, Alara felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a mantle she'd never asked to wear. Tomorrow night, she would stand beside King Cale Draven as he announced their betrothal to a court that would see her as exactly what she was, a political convenience, a stopgap solution to royal succession requirements, an Omega chosen specifically because her weakness made her safe for a man whose strength was so legendary that only complete submission could be tolerated in his presence. But as she stepped into evening air that carried the first hints of approaching winter, Alara made a quiet promise to herself. She might be forced to marry a man who despised everything she represented, might be required to bear children for a bloodline that would never truly accept her, might spend the rest of her life as an unwanted reminder of political compromise rather than chosen love. But she would not disappear entirely, would not let herself be erased by a system that valued her only as a vessel for purposes that served everyone except her, would find ways to maintain some small piece of the person she'd been before. Duty demanded she transform into whatever King Cale Draven needed her to become. The Omega everyone underestimated was about to become queen to a man who had never learned that strength and gentleness weren't mutually exclusive, that submission and dignity could coexist, that sometimes the most profound power lay hidden in those whom the world had taught to believe themselves powerless. In 3 days, she would marry a stranger who looked at her like a stain on his sovereignty. But perhaps, just perhaps, he might discover that the woman he'd been forced to claim was stronger than anyone had given her credit for. including herself. The moon waxed toward fullness above the capital city, marking time until vows would be spoken in duty rather than devotion, until two lives would be bound together by politics rather than choice, until the most feared alpha king in recorded history would discover what it meant to be tied to someone he'd never bothered to see clearly. What none of them, not the council, not King Kale, not even Alara herself, could foresee was the child that would grow from their cold union, carrying within its developing form the power to reshape everything they thought they knew about bloodlines, hierarchy, and the dangerous magic that dwelt in bonds forged despite resistance rather than because of choice. Sometimes the most powerful transformations began with the things people fought hardest against accepting, and sometimes what looked like weakness was actually strength waiting for the right moment to reveal itself and change the world. The Harvest Festival had always been Alara's favorite night of the year, a celebration where rank and bloodline temporarily dissolved into something more human, where the rigid hierarchies that governed daily life softened enough to allow genuine joy and community connection. This year, however, the festival felt more like an elaborate stage set for her public humiliation, every golden lantern and autumn garland mocking her with their cheerful indifference to the personal catastrophe about to unfold. She stood before her chamber mirror, studying a reflection that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The gown the council had sent was magnificent beyond anything she'd ever worn. Deep midnight blue silk that brought out the silver threads in her dark hair, cut with a sophistication that suggested royal seamstresses working to transform minor nobility into something worthy of standing beside a king. The fabric whispered against her skin with every movement, a constant reminder that even her clothing no longer belonged to her, but served purposes beyond her comfort or preference. "You look beautiful, my lady," murmured Sarah, her personal maid, as she made final adjustments to the intricate braiding that had taken 2 hours to achieve. Like a true queen. Queen. The title sat strangely in Alara's mind, carrying weight she wasn't prepared to bear and responsibilities she'd never been trained to fulfill. In 3 hours, she would be formally announced as the future wife of King Kale Draven before the entire court, displayed like a prize that political maneuvering had won, rather than a person who deserved consideration in decisions about her own fate. "Has there been any word from the palace?" she asked quietly, though she suspected the answer would be exactly what she'd feared. "No, my lady. His Majesty hasn't. That is, no messages have been received." Sarah's diplomatic phrasing couldn't quite hide the truth, that King Kale Draven hadn't bothered to communicate with his future wife in any way, hadn't sent formal greetings or requests for private meetings, or even basic acknowledgement that their lives were about to be permanently intertwined. Alara nodded, unsurprised but still feeling the sting of casual dismissal that spoke volumes about what their marriage would entail. She was a political necessity being acquired through proper channels, nothing more significant than furniture being delivered to fill an empty space in royal arrangements. The carriage ride to the palace passed in silence, broken only by the clip-clopping of hooves on cobblestones and the distant sounds of festival celebrations already beginning throughout the capital city. Through curtained windows, she caught glimpses of families gathering in courtyards, children chasing each other between market stalls, couples dancing to music that drifted from taverns, where no one worried about bloodline compatibility or territorial obligations. Normal people living normal lives, making choices based on affection rather than advantage, building futures founded on mutual attraction rather than political convenience. Everything she would never have. The royal palace rose before them like a mountain carved from ambition itself, its towers reaching toward star-filled sky with the kind of imposing grandeur that reminded visitors exactly how small and powerless they were in comparison to the forces that shaped kingdoms. Tonight, torches blazed from every window, banners snapped in autumn wind, and the great courtyard buzzed with activity as the realm's most important families gathered for festivities that would culminate in an announcement that changed everything. Lady Helena had accompanied her for propriety's sake, though her stepmother's attention seemed focused entirely on the political opportunities that Alara's elevation might create for the Nightshade family name. During the carriage ride, she'd offered advice that had more to do with maximizing advantage than surviving what promised to be a deeply challenging transition. "Remember to smile, but not too much," Lady Helena instructed as they approached the palace's main entrance. "Acknowledge greetings, but don't appear overly eager for approval. And for heaven's sake, don't say anything controversial when His Majesty makes the announcement. This is about projecting dignity, not personality." dignity without personality. The perfect description of what they expected her to become. A beautiful ornament that enhanced royal prestige without complicating royal authority. A woman so thoroughly subdued that her presence added legitimacy to the bloodline, without threatening the established order in any meaningful way. Inside the palace, the Great Hall had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. If fairy tales included undercurrents of political maneuvering and carefully calculated social interactions. Hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows across silk-draped walls. Musicians filled the air with melodies that spoke of celebration and joy, and long tables groaned under the weight of delicacies that represented the kingdom's prosperity and abundance. But it was the people who commanded Alara's attention, Lycans from every major territory, their power and influence displayed through clothing that cost more than most families earned in a year, their conversations charged with the kind of subtle meaning that could reshape alliances or destroy reputations with carefully chosen words. These were the individuals who controlled trade routes and territorial boundaries, who decided which bloodlines would prosper and which would fade into historical footnotes. And they were all watching her. The attention wasn't hostile exactly, but it carried weight that made her skin prickle with awareness of being evaluated, categorized, assigned a place in their complex social hierarchy based on assessments she couldn't influence or control. She was the Omega who had somehow captured royal interest, the minor noble whose elevation defied conventional wisdom about appropriate partnerships for alpha kings. Most seemed puzzled by her presence rather than threatened by it, as if they couldn't quite understand what political calculation had led to this particular choice. A few appeared openly dismissive, their expressions suggesting they viewed her as a temporary arrangement that would be quietly dissolved once more suitable alternatives could be arranged. But it was the cluster of young alpha women near the center of the hall who radiated actual hostility, daughters of prominent families whose own ambitions for royal marriage had been derailed by her unexpected selection. Their beauty was undeniable, their breeding impeccable, their political connections far superior to anything the Nightshade name could offer. Yet here she was, wearing the royal blue that marked her as chosen, while they watched from sidelines that should have been hers by right. "Alara Nightshade," one of them said as she passed, her voice carrying just loudly enough to ensure nearby conversations paused to listen. "How surprising to see you here tonight. I had no idea you moved in such elevated circles." Lady Vivian Ashworth, daughter of the Duke of Eastern Territories, possessor of beauty that inspired poetry and political connections that opened doors throughout the realm. Also, according to court gossip, one of several alpha women who had been actively pursuing royal attention before Alara's unexpected selection derailed those ambitions. "Lady Vivian," Alara replied with careful courtesy, acutely aware that every word would be analyzed for signs of weakness, arrogance, or inappropriate confidence. "Thank you for the kind greeting. I hope you're enjoying the festivities." "Oh, we all are." Lady Vivian's smile was sharp as winter steel, particularly the anticipation of tonight's announcements. "I'm sure whatever His Majesty has planned will be quite illuminating for all of us." The words carried implications that made several nearby nobles exchange meaningful glances, and Alara realized that court gossip had already anticipated the evening's revelations. Her engagement might be formally announced tonight, but the political classes had been speculating about royal marriage prospects for months, analyzing every interaction between the king and potential candidates for signs of preference or developing attachment, which meant they all knew exactly how little personal choice had influenced this particular decision. Before she could formulate a response that might navigate the conversational minefield without triggering open confrontation, a ripple of awareness swept through the great hall like wind across water. Conversations paused, attention shifted, and even the most powerful nobles instinctively straightened their postures as the massive doors at the hall's far end began to swing open. King Cale Draven entered like storm-given human form, his presence filling the vast space with authority that needed no proclamation, because it simply was. Even at a distance, even surrounded by hundreds of other powerful Lycans, he commanded attention with the kind of effortless dominance that made ordinary alpha authority seem pale by comparison. Tall and powerfully built, with dark hair and features that suggested both nobility and barely contained violence, he moved through the crowd with predatory grace that parted bodies before him like water flowing around stone. His clothing was formal but understated, black wool and silver threading that spoke of wealth without ostentation, power that didn't need to announce itself, because everyone already understood exactly who and what they were witnessing. But it was his eyes that truly captured attention. Golden, intelligent, holding depths that seemed to catalog and evaluate everything they encountered with the kind of calculating precision that made even his allies slightly nervous. These were the eyes of someone who had learned early that survival depended on seeing threats before they materialized, on understanding motivations that others preferred to keep hidden. As he progressed through the hall, accepting bows and murmured greetings with the distant courtesy of someone fulfilling social obligations rather than seeking genuine connection, those golden eyes swept across the assembled nobles with methodical thoroughness, cataloging faces, noting alliances, measuring loyalty, and potential threat with assessments that would inform future decisions about favor and punishment. And then, inevitably, his gaze found Alara. The impact was immediate and overwhelming, not attraction or recognition or even curiosity, but something colder and more calculating that made her feel like prey being evaluated by a predator, deciding whether she was worth the energy required to hunt her. For a moment that felt suspended outside normal time, they stared at each other across the crowded hall, and she saw her future written in eyes that held no warmth, no welcome, no acknowledgement that she might be anything more than a political inconvenience that duty required him to tolerate. He looked at her like she was a stain on his sovereignty, a reminder of compromise forced upon him by circumstances beyond his control, a necessity so distasteful that even basic courtesy felt like too much effort to expend. Then the moment passed. His attention moved on to other faces and concerns, and Alara was left with the devastating certainty that marriage to King Cale Draven would be exactly as cold and distant as she'd feared. "Well," Lady Vivian murmured beside her, voice carrying satisfaction that barely concealed malicious pleasure. "His Majesty certainly seems enthusiastic about tonight's proceedings." The comment drew nervous laughter from several nearby nobles, and Alara realized that her public humiliation had already begun. Everyone present had witnessed that moment of mutual assessment, had seen the complete lack of warmth or interest in their king's evaluation of his future bride, had drawn obvious conclusions about the political nature of whatever announcement would follow. She was not chosen for love or even attraction. She was a compromise solution to royal obligations, selected for characteristics that made her useful rather than desirable, valued for her willingness to disappear into the background of his reign rather than any quality that might enhance his personal happiness. The evening continued with speeches and toasts and ceremonial presentations that gradually built toward the moment everyone anticipated with varying degrees of excitement, dread, or calculated interest. Alara moved through the social rituals like an actress playing a role she'd never auditioned for, smiling appropriately and speaking when addressed, while her mind churned through possible strategies for surviving what promised to be the most challenging transition of her life. When King Cale finally took his position at the hall's center, commanding absolute attention with nothing more than his presence, the silence that fell was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat thundering against her ribs. Lords and ladies of the realm. His voice carried easily through the vast space, pitched to convey authority without appearing to require effort. Tonight, we gather not just to celebrate our prosperity and abundance, but to share news that affects the future of our bloodline and the stability of our territories. Here it comes, Alara thought, bracing herself for words that would reshape her identity from minor noble to royal consort, from person with individual dreams to vessel for purposes that served everyone's interests except her own. After considerable deliberation and consultation with the council regarding the complex requirements of royal marriage, I am pleased to announce my engagement to Lady Alara Nightshade, daughter of the late Lord Marcus Nightshade, whose diplomatic service to the crown earned our lasting gratitude and respect. The words fell into silence that felt charged with 100 different reactions: surprise, calculation, speculation, and in some quarters barely concealed disappointment that their own ambitions had been definitively derailed by this unexpected selection. Alara felt herself moving forward through the crowd as if pulled by invisible strings, her feet carrying her toward the center of attention despite every instinct screaming that she should flee before this public claiming became irrevocable. Around her, faces turned to watch her progress with expressions ranging from curious to calculating to openly hostile, but she kept her eyes fixed on King Cale's face, trying to read some hint of his true feelings about this announcement in features that revealed nothing beyond polite satisfaction. When she reached his side, He extended his hand with formal courtesy that somehow managed to feel both appropriate and utterly impersonal. His fingers were warm when they closed around hers, but the touch carried no affection, no sense of connection or shared anticipation for their future together. It felt like a business transaction being concluded with appropriate protocol rather than the joining of two lives in partnership. "Lady Alara," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone, while the assembled nobles watched their interaction with predatory attention to detail. "I trust this arrangement meets with your approval." It wasn't really a question, more like verification that she understood her role in whatever political theater was playing out before hundreds of witnesses. But something in his tone suggested he might be genuinely curious about her feelings, as if her opinion might actually matter in some small way, despite the obvious political nature of their engagement. "I'm honored by your Majesty's selection," she replied, the formal words feeling strange on her tongue even as she recognized their necessity. "I hope I prove worthy of the confidence you've placed in my family's bloodline." His golden eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed in ways that had nothing to do with the crowd of witnesses surrounding them. For a moment, she thought she saw something that might have been surprise flicker across his features, as if her response had deviated from whatever he'd expected. "I'm certain you will," he said finally, though his tone suggested he was reserving judgment about what worthy might actually entail in their specific circumstances. Around them, the great hall erupted into applause and congratulations that felt both genuine and performative, nobles celebrating not because they felt joy about the royal couple's happiness, but because appropriate response to royal announcements was part of the complex social dance that kept them in favor with those who controlled their fates. As King Kale led her through the ritual of accepting well wishes and formal congratulations from the realm's most powerful families, Alara found herself studying his profile and trying to understand what kind of man she'd been bound to serve for the rest of her life. There was intelligence there, certainly, and the kind of controlled strength that came from years of wielding absolute authority. But there was also something else, a distance that felt less like royal dignity and more like carefully maintained isolation, as if he'd learned to trust no one completely and found that distance safer than the potential complications of genuine connection. "When will the ceremony take place, Your Majesty?" asked Duke Morrison, his question carrying the kind of interest that suggested political implications were being calculated, even as social pleasantries were exchanged. "Within the fortnight," King Kale replied without hesitation. "The Council has advised that prompt resolution of royal succession matters serves the kingdom's stability, and I see no reason to delay arrangements that have already been finalized." No reason to delay. No mention of courtship or getting to know each other, or allowing time for any kind of personal connection to develop between them. Just efficient completion of necessary business that had been reduced to administrative details, rather than treated as the foundation for a partnership that would shape both their futures. Later, as the evening wound down and nobles began making their farewells, Alara found herself standing beside the man who would become her husband in 2 weeks, accepting congratulations that felt increasingly hollow with each repetition. They made polite conversation with visiting dignitaries and territorial representatives, presenting a united front that satisfied political requirements, while revealing nothing about the personal dynamics that would govern their actual marriage. "Lady Alara," King Kale said, when they finally had a moment of relative privacy near the great windows that overlooked the palace gardens. "I trust you understand that our union will be practical in nature. The Council has made certain expectations clear regarding royal obligations and bloodline continuation, but beyond those requirements, I have no intention of imposing unnecessary complications on your daily life." The words were clearly meant to be reassuring, a promise that he wouldn't demand more from their marriage than duty required, that she would have freedom within the bounds of her royal responsibilities. But they also confirmed what she'd suspected from the moment their engagement had been announced. He saw her as a political necessity rather than a partner, someone to be managed efficiently rather than known personally. "I understand, Your Majesty," she replied quietly. "I have no expectations beyond fulfilling whatever obligations come with my new position." Something flickered in his golden eyes at her response. Surprise again, or perhaps approval that she wasn't going to demand emotional considerations that might complicate their arrangement. "Good," he said finally. "Then we understand each other perfectly." But as Alara rode home through streets still celebrating the royal engagement with music and laughter that drifted from taverns and private parties, She wondered if understanding each other was actually possible when one person had been chosen specifically because they could be safely ignored by the other. In 2 weeks, she would marry King Cale Draven in a ceremony that bound them together legally, while keeping them fundamentally separate in every way that actually mattered. She would become queen to a man who looked at her like a problem to be managed, rather than a woman to be cherished, wife to someone whose legendary strength was matched only by his equally legendary contempt for the very qualities that defined her Omega nature. But perhaps, she thought as moonlight painted her chamber walls in silver shadows, there might be more to discover about each of them than either currently suspected. Perhaps the king who had learned to trust no one might find something worth protecting in the Omega everyone underestimated. Perhaps the woman who had spent her life being overlooked might prove stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever given her credit for. Marriage to King Cale Draven would challenge everything she'd believed about her own capabilities and worth. But it might also reveal truths about strength, submission, and the complicated space between duty and desire that neither of them was prepared to acknowledge yet. The moon waned toward darkness above the royal capital, marking time until vows would be spoken in obligation rather than affection, until two strangers would be bound together by politics rather than choice, until the most feared Alpha King in recorded history would discover whether the Omega he'd been forced to claim could survive the cold reality of life, beside someone who had never learned to need anyone but himself. What neither could foresee was the child that would grow from their dutiful union, carrying within its developing form the power to transform everything they thought they knew about bloodlines, hierarchy, and the dangerous truth that sometimes love and hate were separated by margins too thin to measure accurately, until crisis forced people to discover who they really were beneath the roles that politics had assigned them to play. The wedding ceremony felt like watching someone else's life unfold from a great distance, as if Alara's consciousness had detached itself from her body to observe the elaborate pageantry that bound her permanently to a man who regarded her with the same distant courtesy he might show a useful piece of furniture. The great cathedral blazed with thousands of candles, its vaulted ceilings echoing with music that spoke of celebration and joy, while representatives from every major territory witnessed the union that would theoretically ensure royal succession and territorial stability for generations to come. She stood beside King Cale in a gown that cost more than most families earned in a decade, ivory silk threaded with silver that caught the candlelight like captured starlight, creating an illusion of ethereal beauty that the kingdom's most skilled seamstresses had crafted to transform minor Omega nobility into something worthy of standing beside royalty. Every detail had been orchestrated to perfection, from the ancient vows that bound them legally to the ceremonial crowning that marked her transition from Lady Alara to Queen Alara, though the title felt as foreign and uncomfortable as everything else about her new identity. King Cale performed his part with the same controlled precision he brought to all royal obligations, speaking the required words with appropriate gravity, while his golden eyes remained distant, as if he were fulfilling a contract rather than taking a wife. When he lifted her veil and pressed the traditional kiss to her lips that sealed their union, the contact was brief, respectful, and utterly devoid of anything resembling warmth or genuine affection. It felt exactly like what it was, a political transaction being concluded with proper protocol rather than the joining of two hearts in partnership. The feast that followed stretched endlessly through courses that showcased the kingdom's prosperity, while providing opportunities for the realm's most powerful families to assess the new queen and adjust their political calculations accordingly. Alara sat at the high table beside her husband, smiling appropriately and responding to congratulations that felt increasingly hollow with each repetition, while King Cale engaged in conversations about trade agreements and territorial boundaries that reminded everyone present exactly where his priorities lay. "Your Majesty seems content with the evening's proceedings," observed Lady Vivian Ashworth during one of several formal presentations of wedding gifts from territorial representatives. Her tone carried undertones that suggested she'd already concluded the marriage was exactly as political and passionless as court gossip had predicted. "I'm grateful for the kindness everyone has shown," Alara replied carefully, acutely aware that every word would be analyzed and repeated throughout the social networks that governed court life. "His Majesty and I both appreciate the support of our people during this important transition." But even as she spoke the appropriate words, Alara couldn't help noticing the way King Cale's attention never quite focused on her for more than brief moments required by protocol. He was polite, certainly, and appropriately attentive to her needs during the formal ceremonies, but she might as well have been invisible for all the personal interest he showed in the woman who had just become permanently bound to his life and fate. The realization that this distance would characterize the rest of their marriage settled in her chest like a stone, heavy with implications she wasn't prepared to fully process. She would spend her life beside someone who saw her as a duty, rather than a person, who would provide for her material needs, while remaining fundamentally uninterested in her thoughts, dreams, or individual existence beyond her function as a vessel for royal heirs. Later, when the formal celebrations finally concluded and they were escorted to the royal chambers that would now serve as her home, the reality of her situation became even more starkly apparent. The suite was magnificent beyond anything she'd ever imagined occupying. Sitting rooms and bedchambers and private studies furnished with pieces that represented centuries of royal accumulation and artistic patronage. Every surface spoke of wealth and power, and the kind of refined taste that came from generations of privilege. But it was also clearly King Kael's domain, filled with his books and personal effects, and arranged according to preferences she'd never been consulted about. She felt like an intruder in spaces that had been designed around someone else's comfort and convenience, an unwelcome addition to environments that functioned perfectly well without her presence. "Your belongings have been moved to the adjoining chambers," King Kael informed her, with the same business-like courtesy he'd shown throughout their wedding day. "I trust you'll find the accommodations suitable for your needs. If anything requires adjustment, speak with the household staff and they'll address any concerns." Adjoining chambers. Not shared quarters or even connected rooms, but separate spaces that happened to be located near each other within the royal suite's complex layout. The message was clear. They would share proximity required by protocol, while maintaining the personal distance that made their arrangement tolerable for both parties. "Of course, Your Majesty," she replied quietly, uncertain whether she felt relieved or disappointed by this confirmation that their marriage would be exactly as cold and impersonal as she'd anticipated. "Kyle," he said unexpectedly, pausing in his efficient organization of wedding gifts that had arrived throughout the evening. "In private, you may address me by name rather than title. We are married now, after all." The small concession felt simultaneously generous and inadequate, an acknowledgement of their changed relationship that nonetheless maintained careful boundaries around intimacy or genuine familiarity. He was offering her permission to use his personal name, while making it clear that nothing else about their interaction would be particularly personal. "Thank you, Kael," she said, testing the unfamiliar syllables and finding them strange on her tongue. "I appreciate the consideration." He nodded acknowledgement, then continued his methodical sorting of gifts and correspondence that had accumulated during their wedding festivities, his attention already shifting away from her toward administrative concerns that held more immediate interest than getting to know his new wife. Ilara retreated to her assigned chambers, overwhelmed by spaces that were beautiful and comfortable and utterly foreign to everything she'd known about home and belonging. A team of servants had arranged her possessions with careful attention to creating an environment that might feel familiar despite its grandeur. But her few personal belongings looked lost and insignificant among furnishings that had been chosen to complement royal dignity rather than individual personality. The weeks that followed established patterns that would define their marriage for months to come. King Kael treated her with unfailing courtesy and appropriate consideration for her position, ensuring she had everything necessary for fulfilling her royal obligations, while maintaining professional distance that reminded her constantly of the political nature of their union. They shared meals when protocol required it, appeared together at formal functions where her presence enhanced his legitimacy, and conducted themselves in public with the kind of dignified partnership that satisfied political observers, while revealing nothing about the personal dynamics that governed their actual relationship. In private, however, they remained essentially strangers. Kael spent his days managing the complex responsibilities of ruling a vast territory, consulting with advisors and territorial representatives about matters that ranged from trade disputes to military preparedness to resource allocation decisions that affected hundreds of thousands of lives. When he returned to their chambers each evening, he was polite but distant, sharing basic information about his activities when she inquired, but showing no interest in her own daily experiences or opinions about court life. Ilara, meanwhile, struggled to find meaningful ways to occupy her time within the rigid constraints of royal protocol. She was expected to oversee certain household functions and participate in charitable activities that enhanced the crown's public image, But these responsibilities felt hollow and performative rather than genuinely purposeful. Most of her days were spent in supervised activities that kept her busy without allowing her to develop genuine expertise or influence in areas that truly mattered. The isolation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of her new life. Court society included her in formal gatherings and ceremonial functions, but genuine friendship proved elusive when everyone understood that relationship with the queen carried political implications beyond simple personal affinity. She was treated with respect and deference that prevented meaningful connection, surrounded by people who were careful to maintain appropriate distance, rather than risk appearing to curry favor or seek inappropriate influence. 3 months into their marriage, during one of the rare evenings when they found themselves sharing dinner alone, rather than entertaining visiting dignitaries, Alara finally gathered courage to address the elephant that had been lurking in their royal chambers since their wedding night. "Kyle," she said quietly, setting down her wine glass with hands that trembled only slightly, "I've been thinking about the expectations regarding heirs and royal succession. The council has made their requirements quite clear, and I understand that fulfilling those obligations is part of my purpose here." He looked up from his own meal, golden eyes studying her face with the kind of careful attention he typically reserved for complex political problems requiring immediate solution. For a moment, she thought she saw something that might have been surprise flicker across his features, as if he'd assumed she would avoid discussing topics that required addressing the more intimate aspects of their arrangement. "The council has indeed been persistent in their reminders about royal succession requirements," he said carefully, his tone suggesting he found their pressure as distasteful as she did. "Though I see no reason to rush into obligations that can be managed according to our mutual convenience rather than external pressure." Our mutual convenience. Even discussions about producing heirs were being framed as administrative decisions rather than anything approaching personal intimacy or shared desire for building a family together. "I simply wanted you to know," she continued, forcing herself to meet his gaze directly, despite the heat rising in her cheeks, "that I'm prepared to fulfill whatever expectations come with my position. I don't want you to feel that I'm avoiding responsibilities or making your life more complicated than it needs to be." The silence that followed her words felt charged with implications neither seemed prepared to address directly. King Kale studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed in ways that had nothing to do with the conversation's intimate undertones, as if he were trying to understand motivations that didn't match his expectations about Omega nature or political marriage dynamics. "You continue to surprise me," he said finally, his voice carrying something that might have been approval mixed with genuine puzzlement. "Most women in your position would either be demanding attention I'm not prepared to provide, or avoiding obligations they found distasteful. You seem remarkably practical about circumstances that must be difficult to navigate." Practical. It wasn't exactly a romantic sentiment, but coming from someone who had shown her nothing but distant courtesy for 3 months, it felt almost like recognition of her individual character, rather than just her functional utility. "I've had time to adjust my expectations," she replied honestly. "I understand what this marriage is and what it isn't. I'm trying to find ways to be useful and fulfilled within those parameters, rather than wasting energy wanting things that were never part of our arrangement." Something shifted in his expression at her words. Not warmth exactly, but perhaps a grudging respect for her willingness to accept reality without complaint or manipulation. For the first time since their wedding, she felt like he was seeing her as a person, rather than simply as the Omega who had been installed in his life by political necessity. "In that case," he said quietly, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his own, "perhaps we might begin exploring those particular aspects of our obligations. When you feel ready, of course. I have no desire to make demands that would cause you distress or discomfort." The touch of his hand was warm, careful, carrying the kind of restrained strength that reminded her exactly how powerful he was, while reassuring her that he had no intention of using that power in ways that might hurt her. For the first time since their wedding, physical contact between them felt like connection, rather than mere protocol. "I would like that," she said softly, surprised by how much she meant it. Not because she'd developed romantic feelings for her distant husband, but because she was tired of feeling useless and peripheral to the life she'd been forced to accept. If producing heirs would give her genuine purpose, and perhaps even earn her a measure of respect from the man she'd married, then she was prepared to embrace that responsibility wholeheartedly. What followed was the strangest courtship imaginable. Two married people learning to navigate intimacy that was required by duty rather than inspired by desire, developing familiarity with each other's bodies and preferences, while maintaining the emotional distance that made their arrangement tolerable for both parties. King Kale proved to be a considerate partner in all physical matters, ensuring her comfort and taking care to make their encounters pleasurable rather than merely functional, but he remained fundamentally reserved about sharing thoughts or feelings that went beyond immediate practical concerns. 2 months later, when Alara woke to nausea that persisted despite having eaten nothing that should have caused digestive distress, she felt her world shift on its axis in ways that would reshape everything about her understanding of her place in the royal hierarchy. The royal physician confirmed what she'd already suspected with growing certainty. She was pregnant, carrying the heir that would secure the Draven bloodline and fulfill the primary obligation that had made her marriage politically necessary. The news should have been cause for celebration, validation of her worth and purpose within the royal framework that had been imposed upon her life. Instead, it filled her with terror that cut deeper than any fear she'd experienced before. Because an Omega pregnancy was rare enough under normal circumstances, but an Omega carrying a Lycan king's heir was unprecedented, medically dangerous, politically explosive, and potentially impossible according to everything the royal physicians understood about bloodline compatibility and genetic inheritance. "Your Majesty, Doctor," Aldrich said carefully as he completed his examination, his weathered features creased with concern that had nothing to do with normal pregnancy complications. "I must ask, are you absolutely certain about the timeline of conception? The circumstances that led to this pregnancy?" "What do you mean?" Alara asked, though dread was already settling in her stomach like ice water. "Omega physiology," he explained gently, "is not typically compatible with alpha royal bloodlines, particularly those as pure and powerful as the Draven lineage. The genetic markers should have prevented conception entirely, yet here we are facing a pregnancy that challenges everything we understand about reproductive compatibility and bloodline inheritance. Are you saying the child isn't—" She couldn't complete the sentence, couldn't voice the implication that would destroy everything she'd built since becoming queen. "I'm saying the child is definitely His Majesty's," Dr. Aldrich said quickly, "but its existence suggests possibilities about your own bloodline that may not have been fully understood or documented. This pregnancy shouldn't be possible according to established medical knowledge, which means either our understanding is incomplete, or there are factors about your heritage that haven't been properly investigated." As evening approached, and she waited for King Kale to return from his daily administrative duties, Alara found herself staring at hands that had begun to tremble with anxiety about how to share news that would change everything about their carefully structured relationship. A child would bind them permanently in ways that went beyond political convenience, would create obligations and connections that couldn't be dissolved if their arrangement proved unsatisfactory to either party. More terrifyingly, it would make her valuable in ways that had nothing to do with her individual worth, and everything to do with her function as the vessel carrying the future of the most powerful bloodline in Lycan history. When King Kale finally entered their shared chambers, exhaustion marking his features after what had clearly been a challenging day of governance, Alara felt her carefully rehearsed explanations dissolve into incoherent nervousness about sharing news that would reshape both their futures irrevocably. "Kyle," she said quietly, rising from the chair where she'd been waiting for hours, "I have something important to tell you. Something that changes everything about our situation here." He paused in his efficient organization of documents and correspondence, golden eyes studying her face with the sharp attention he typically reserved for crisis management or potential threats requiring immediate response. "What is it?" he asked, moving toward her with fluid grace that reminded her exactly how dangerous he could be when circumstances demanded action rather than patience. "I'm pregnant," she said simply, the words falling into silence that felt charged with implications neither of them had been prepared to consider when they'd begun exploring the physical aspects of their marriage duties. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable, not joy or satisfaction, or even relief that royal succession obligations were being fulfilled, but shock so profound that she saw his carefully controlled composure crack for the first time since their wedding. He stared at her as if she'd announced something impossible rather than merely unexpected, his face cycling through emotions she couldn't fully interpret. He stopped, started again, clearly struggling to process information that challenged assumptions he'd made about their relationship and its probable outcomes. That's not supposed to be possible." "I know," she whispered, tears beginning to form despite her efforts to maintain composure. "Dr. Aldrich said the same thing. He thinks there might be aspects of my bloodline that weren't properly documented, genetic factors that could explain how this pregnancy was able to occur despite all the medical knowledge suggesting it should have been impossible." King Kale moved toward her with careful deliberation, reaching out to place gentle hands on her shoulders, while his eyes searched her face for signs of, what? Deception? Fear? Joy? She couldn't tell what he was looking for, only that the news had affected him more deeply than she'd anticipated. "Are you—" He paused, seemed to reconsider his question. "How do you feel about this development? About becoming a mother under these circumstances?" "Terrified," she admitted honestly, leaning into the solid comfort of his touch, despite the emotional distance that typically characterized their interactions. "Excited, confused, worried about what this means for both of us and for the child. Everything is about to change, isn't it?" "Everything," he agreed quietly, and for the first time since their marriage began, his voice carried something that sounded almost like genuine emotion, rather than careful diplomatic neutrality. As they stood together in the growing darkness of their royal chambers, two strangers bound by duty who were about to become parents to a child that shouldn't exist, Alara realized that their marriage was about to be tested in ways neither had anticipated when they'd exchanged vows motivated by political necessity rather than personal choice. The Omega everyone underestimated was carrying the heir that would reshape everything about Lycan hierarchy and bloodline inheritance. And the king who had never learned to need anyone was about to discover what it meant to have something worth protecting that could be taken away by forces beyond his absolute control. Outside their windows, winter settled over the royal capital with the patient inevitability of seasons that mark time regardless of human concerns. While inside, two people who had never expected to matter to each other prepared to navigate challenges that would test every assumption they'd made about strength, vulnerability, and the dangerous space between duty and something that might eventually grow into love. The child that would emerge from their union would carry within its developing form the power to challenge every established law about bloodline compatibility and genetic inheritance. But first, its parents would have to survive the revelation that their political marriage had produced something unprecedented, miraculous, and potentially dangerous enough to reshape the balance of power itself. 3 years later, the nursery windows overlooked the palace gardens, where spring had painted the world in shades of hope and renewal. But Alara's attention was focused entirely on the small figure sleeping peacefully in the ornate crib that had been crafted specifically for the heir whose very existence had rewritten every assumption about bloodline compatibility and genetic inheritance. Princess Lyanna Draven possessed her father's golden eyes and her mother's dark hair, but it was the aura of power that surrounded her even in sleep that marked her as something unprecedented in Lycan history. At 3 years old, she already showed signs of abilities that transcended normal alpha or omega capabilities, an intelligence that seemed to understand conversations far beyond her vocabulary, an intuitive grasp of pack dynamics that left seasoned courtiers struggling to keep pace with her observations, and a presence that made even the most dominant alphas instinctively defer to her natural authority. "She's going to be magnificent," Kale said softly, moving to stand beside Alara as they watched their daughter's peaceful slumber. His arm slid around her waist with the easy familiarity that had developed over months of shared wonder and protective instincts that neither had anticipated when duty first bound them together. "She's going to be dangerous," Alara replied with equal affection and concern, leaning into the solid comfort of his embrace. "The council is already making noises about accelerating her training, bringing in specialists to help her understand abilities that we're still struggling to categorize or control." 3 years had transformed their marriage from political arrangement into something far more complex and genuine than either had thought possible. The pregnancy had forced them to truly see each other, not as alpha and omega fulfilling prescribed roles, but as individuals navigating unprecedented circumstances that required trust, partnership, and the kind of intimate cooperation that couldn't be faked or performed. Kale had proven himself capable of tenderness that his legendary reputation had never suggested, sitting with her through difficult nights when pregnancy complications threatened both mother and child, defending her against council pressure to submit to medical procedures that treated her more like a valuable broodmare than a person deserving of consideration and respect. And Alara had discovered reserves of strength she'd never known she possessed, standing up to territorial alphas who questioned her fitness to raise the future ruler, developing political instincts that complemented her husband's more direct approach to governance. "Let them make their noises," Kale said with the quiet authority that had only grown more profound since becoming a father. "Lyanna will train when she's ready, learn what she needs to learn, become whoever she's meant to be, but she'll do it as our daughter, not as the council's project or anyone else's political tool." The transformation in their relationship had been gradual, but undeniable. Shared worry for their child's unprecedented abilities had led to long conversations about parenthood, governance, and the kind of world they wanted to build for the next generation. Physical intimacy born from duty had evolved into genuine affection and partnership that surprised them both with its depth and complexity. And mutual respect developed from crisis had grown into something that felt remarkably like love, though neither had spoken the word directly. "Your Majesties," came a soft voice from the doorway, where Sarah had learned to announce herself carefully when approaching the royal family's private moments. "The evening reports have arrived, and there are several matters requiring your Majesty's attention before tomorrow's council session." Kyle sighed, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of Alara's head before reluctantly releasing her from his embrace. "Duty calls as always, but perhaps—" He paused, studying her face with the kind of focused attention that still made her heart flutter despite 3 years of marriage. "Perhaps you'd join me tonight? Your insights about the territorial disputes have proven remarkably astute, and I value your perspective on matters that affect our people's welfare." The invitation represented more than professional courtesy. It was acknowledgement that she had become his true partner in governance, that her opinions and judgment had earned his genuine respect rather than mere tolerance. From Omega wife, tolerated by political necessity, to queen whose counsel was actively sought and valued, her transformation had been as dramatic as their daughter's unprecedented abilities. "Of course," she replied, warmth spreading through her chest at the recognition that she had found not just acceptance but genuine purpose within the role that had initially felt like a beautifully appointed prison. As they made their way toward the royal offices where the evening's work awaited, Alara caught a glimpse of their reflection in the polished windows, king and queen moving in perfect synchronization, two people who had learned to complement each other's strengths while supporting each other through challenges that had tested every assumption they'd made about duty, partnership, and the space between. An obligation and choice. Behind them, Princess Lyanna slept peacefully under the watchful protection of guards whose loyalty had been earned through her parents' demonstration that strength and gentleness weren't mutually exclusive, that true authority came from service rather than domination, that the most powerful bonds were forged not through force, but through the patient accumulation of trust and respect. The Omega everyone had underestimated had become a queen, whose wisdom shaped policy throughout the realm. The king who had never learned to need anyone had discovered that sharing power made him stronger rather than weaker. And their daughter, impossible, miraculous, dangerous, would inherit a kingdom where bloodline meant less than character, where strength was measured by protection rather than conquest, where love had proven capable of transforming even the most resistant hearts. In the end, it had never really been about the marriage forced upon them by political necessity. It had been about two people brave enough to see past the roles they'd been assigned to discover who they could become when given the freedom to choose each other again and again, despite circumstances that should have made genuine connection impossible. The future stretched before them, filled with challenges that would test everything they'd built together. But they would face those challenges as partners who had learned that the most profound transformations often began with resistance overcome, through patience, understanding earned through crisis, and love discovered in the space between what was forced upon them and what they chose to make of it. Their daughter would reshape the world, but she would do it with the foundation they had given her, proof that strength and gentleness could coexist, that duty and desire weren't mutually exclusive, that sometimes the most powerful magic was simply two people choosing to see the best in each other, even when everything else suggested they should remain strangers. The Lycan heir that shouldn't exist would grow up knowing that she was loved not for her unprecedented abilities or political value, but for the miracle of her existence and the bridge she had built between two hearts that had learned to beat in harmony despite everything that should have kept them apart. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, Make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.